There is a world beneath your feet that almost nobody has ever seen. Right now, underneath fields that stretch from the highlands of Peru to the flatlands of Idaho, something extraordinary is happening in total darkness. No sunlight reaches it. No rain touches it directly. No human eye watches over it. And yet, in this hidden underground world, one of the most important foods in human history is quietly building itself, cell by cell, molecule by molecule, in a process so precise and so beautiful that even the scientists who study it still shake their heads in wonder. You've eaten it your whole life. You've probably never thought twice about it. But the potato, that humble, knobby, dirt-covered thing you pull from a supermarket shelf, has a story beneath the ground that would genuinely take your breath away if you could see it. And today, for the first time, you're going to. Let's start with something that almost nobody knows. The potato is not a root. Most people assume that because it grows underground, it must be a root like a carrot or a beet or a radish. But the potato is something entirely different. It is a stem, a swollen, modified underground stem called a tuber. And that single fact changes everything about how it grows, how it stores food, how it reproduces, and why it became one of the most important plants in human history. Think about what a stem does above ground. It carries water and nutrients from the roots up to the leaves. It holds the plant upright. It connects everything together. Now imagine that same stem deciding, instead of reaching upward toward the sun, to dive underground, swell up with stored energy, and essentially become a living food warehouse buried in the dark. That is the potato. It isn't growing fruit. It isn't making seeds, at least not primarily. It is doing something far more interesting. It is building an underground storage system so efficient, so energy-dense, and so reliable that it has fed entire civilizations, changed the course of empires, and on one terrible occasion caused the greatest human disaster in European history. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because before we talk about any of that, we need to go underground. We need to start at the very beginning with a single, wrinkled potato sitting in cool, dark soil, and follow the entire secret journey from that first moment to the extraordinary system that eventually becomes the potatoes on your plate. Are you ready? Good, because what happens underground is stranger, more complicated, and more beautiful than you ever imagined. It begins with what farmers call a seed potato. Now this is already interesting because a seed potato is not actually a seed. It's a potato. A real potato, just like the ones you eat, except that a farmer has carefully selected it for one specific purpose, to be buried in the ground so it can give rise to an entirely new plant. Here's how it works. If you look closely at a potato really closely, you'll notice that its surface is covered with small, dimpled indentations. Farmers call these eyes. And that word is more poetic than most farmers realize because, in a sense, these eyes really do see. Not light exactly, but they sense conditions. They sense temperature, moisture, and time. And when those conditions are right, something inside those eyes wakes up. Inside each eye, tucked under that rough, papery skin, is a dormant bud. A tiny sleeping point of life that has been waiting, sometimes for months, for exactly the right moment to begin. The temperature has to be right. Not too cold, which would stop all growth. Not too warm, which would cause the bud to develop too quickly and waste energy before it's in the ground. The ideal soil temperature for this moment is somewhere between 7 and 12 degrees Celsius, cool enough to feel almost cold to your bare hand, but warm enough to whisper to that sleeping bud, "It is time." And then in total darkness, the bud begins to move. The first thing you'd see, if you could somehow watch this in real time, is a sprout. A pale, slightly purple-tinged shoot that pushes out of the eye with extraordinary slowness, a few millimeters a day at first. It has no green color yet because green requires chlorophyll, and chlorophyll requires light, and there is no light down here. Instead, This first shoot is powered entirely by the energy stored inside the potato itself. This is one of the things that makes potatoes remarkable compared to most plants. When a regular seed germinates, a tomato seed, a sunflower seed, a grain of wheat, it starts with almost nothing. A tiny reserve of energy packed into a shell barely larger than a grain of sand. That seedling has to find light and start photosynthesizing almost immediately, or it dies. But the potato seedling starts with a massive advantage. It is attached to a whole potato, a food warehouse that might weigh anywhere from 50 grams to several hundred grams, packed with starch and water and minerals, all of which the young shoot can draw on freely as it pushes through the soil toward the surface. This is why potatoes grow so reliably, even in difficult conditions. They don't have to scramble for energy from day one. They start with reserves that give them time to navigate obstacles in the soil, time to push past rocks, time to find the optimal direction to grow. But here is something that surprises most people. The shoot doesn't just grow upward, not at first. Before it reaches for the light above, it sends something else in the opposite direction. It sends roots. Even before the shoot breaks the surface, fine white roots are threading themselves outward and downward from the base of the seed potato. These roots are incredibly slender, barely thicker than a human hair in some cases. But they are the plant's first connection to the outside world, its first way of gathering the water and minerals it will eventually need. And they move through the soil in a way that is, if you slow it down with time-lapse cameras, surprisingly purposeful. Roots don't grow in straight lines. They explore. They probe. They follow gradients of moisture and mineral concentration through a process that scientists call tropism, a kind of directional growth response to environmental signals. A root will literally bend and turn in response to what it senses in the soil around it. Water pulls roots toward it through a process called hydrotropism. Gravity pulls them downward through gravitropism. Chemical signals from minerals and nutrients in the soil can redirect growth toward richer patches of earth through a process called chemotropism. In other words, the root system of a potato plant is not just growing randomly through the soil. It is, in a very real sense, navigating. And while those roots are exploring outward, something else is beginning on the shoot that's pushing toward the surface. Something that will eventually determine how many potatoes this plant can actually produce. The shoot is growing faster now. Powered by the reserves of the seed potato below, it pushes through the soil layer by layer. And as it moves upward, something remarkable is happening along its length. At intervals along the shoot, at the points where leaves would eventually grow above ground, the plant is already forming the structures that will become its underground stems. These are called stolons, and they are the secret engineers of the potato. A stolon is a horizontal, underground stem, thinner than a pencil, pale white, growing outward from the main shoot in all directions like spokes on a wheel. Each stolon grows sideways through the soil, extending outward sometimes 15 to 20 centimeters from the main plant before the tip curls downward and begins to swell. That swelling tip is where your potato forms. Right there, at the end of a pale, horizontal underground stem in complete darkness, the cells begin to multiply faster than the stolon can grow. They expand. They fill with starch. They draw water from the roots through the vascular system of the plant. They accumulate minerals like potassium, phosphorus, iron. And very slowly, over the course of weeks, they build what will eventually become a potato. It is a process of almost architectural precision. The plant isn't just dumping starch randomly into a blob. It's constructing a structure with a defined skin layer, internal flesh organized into distinct cellular patterns, a vascular system running through it, and those characteristic eyes, already forming at regular intervals along its surface, ready for the next generation. But here's the thing that I find most extraordinary about this whole process. The potato plant above ground and the potato forming below ground are, in a very real sense, having a conversation. Scientists have known for decades that plants communicate internally using chemical signals, hormones that travel through the plant's vascular system and trigger different responses in different parts of the plant. But the conversation between a potato plant's leaves and its developing tubers underground is remarkably sophisticated. Here is how it works. Up in the leaves, the plant is constantly monitoring the length of the day, not the warmth, not the rainfall, the actual length of daylight. This is called photoperiodism, and it is one of the most elegant sensory systems in the plant kingdom. When the days begin to shorten, as they naturally do in late summer and autumn, the leaves of the potato plant detect this change. They don't see it the way your eyes see light. Instead, special protein molecules in the leaf cells respond to the ratio of light to darkness in each 24-hour cycle. When that ratio crosses a threshold, the leaves begin producing a hormone called phloregin, which travels downward through the plant's vascular system toward the roots and stolons. When phloregin reaches the stolon tips, it triggers tuberization, the swelling, the starch accumulation, the construction of the potato. In other words, the leaves reading the length of the day are sending a message underground to say, summer is ending, build the storage, now. The plant is preparing for winter, even though winter is still weeks away. And the tubers respond immediately. Growth that was slow and exploratory shifts suddenly into an accelerated phase. Starch synthesis ramps up dramatically. Water is drawn in from the roots. Minerals accumulate at a faster rate. The potato is now in what farmers call the bulking phase, and this is where the real action happens. But this is also where the dangers begin, because right now in the soil, the potato isn't just growing. It's being hunted. Sound of soil again, but now something slightly ominous underneath it. The soil around a potato plant is not empty space. It is, in fact, one of the most densely populated environments on Earth. A single teaspoon of healthy agricultural soil contains more living organisms than there are people on this planet. Billions of bacteria, millions of fungi, thousands of nematodes, tiny, thread-like worms that are completely invisible to the naked eye. Mites. Springtails, protozoa. A complex, churning community of life that scientists are only now beginning to fully understand. Most of these organisms are harmless to the potato. Many of them are actively helpful, breaking down organic matter, releasing nutrients the plant can absorb, creating the loose, crumbly soil structure that allows roots to penetrate easily. But some of them have found, over millions of years of evolution, that the potato is an extraordinary food source. And they are waiting in the soil, in almost every field every year, for the moment when a developing tuber comes within reach. The most feared of these is something that looks, under a microscope, almost beautiful. It's called Phytophthora infestans. And it has a history that is, quite literally, soaked in human tragedy. Microscope footage of Phytophthora spores, haunting. Phytophthora infestans is not technically a fungus, although it looks and behaves like one. It belongs to a group of organisms called oomycetes, sometimes called water molds, that are more closely related to algae than to true fungi. But this distinction matters less than what it does. What it does is destroy potatoes. It attacks through the leaves first, creating dark, water-soaked lesions that spread rapidly in cool, wet conditions. White, fuzzy growth appears on the undersides of leaves. That's the organism releasing spores, millions of them, into the air and into the soil. And once those spores reach the developing tubers underground, the damage is devastating. The potato flesh turns brown, then black, then collapses into a wet, rotten mass that smells, according to farmers who have experienced it, like nothing else on Earth. This organism, this microscopic, near-invisible invader, is the cause of the Great Famine. The Irish Famine of 1845 to 1852. The event that killed approximately 1 million people and caused another million to emigrate. The event that reduced Ireland's population by nearly 25% in 7 years. The event that reshaped the demographics of the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom as desperate, starving families boarded ships in search of food and survival. All because a microscopic oomycete arrived in Europe, found a continent growing enormous quantities of one particular potato variety with essentially no genetic resistance, and swept through field after field after field. The potato had become so central to Irish survival, particularly for the rural poor, who in some cases were eating as many as 14 potatoes a day, because it was the most calorie-dense, affordable food available, that when the potato failed, there was nothing left. One crop, one organism, one catastrophe. The scale of this is almost impossible to comprehend, and it is why, to this day, farmers across the world monitor their potato fields with a vigilance that borders on obsession. Because Phytophthora infestans didn't disappear in 1852. It never went away. It evolved. It developed resistance to fungicides. New strains emerged, and it remains, right now, the single most destructive pathogen in potato farming worldwide. Every year globally, it causes crop losses and control costs estimated at somewhere between 5 and 7 billion US dollars. A single organism that you can only see under a microscope. But this isn't the only enemy waiting in the soil. While Phytophthora attacks from above and then works its way down, other threats are already inside the soil, moving through it, searching for the developing tubers by chemical signal. The wireworm is one of them. It doesn't look dangerous. It looks honestly like a small copper wire, hence the name, about 2 to 3 centimeters long, smooth and hard-bodied. But it is the larval stage of the click beetle, and it lives underground for 3 to 5 years in this larval form, boring through plant roots and tubers with its hardened mouthparts. A wireworm can hollow out a potato tuber from the inside, leaving a network of tunnels that, while not always devastating to the crop, makes the potato completely unmarketable. A potato with wireworm damage can't be sold. It can't be stored. It's a total loss. And finding wireworms before they find your tubers is, to put it politely, extremely difficult. They live underground. They move underground. They feed underground. By the time a farmer sees wireworm damage when the potatoes are dug up at harvest, it's far too late to do anything about it. This is one of the central challenges of underground farming that most people never think about. You cannot see your crop. You cannot watch it. You cannot observe the problems developing in real time and respond to them the way you can when you're growing tomatoes or wheat or apples. The potato hides everything underground, and a farmer often doesn't know how the season has gone until the moment the harvester cuts into the soil and the potatoes begin to emerge. It is, in a very real sense, farming with your eyes closed. But the problems underground go deeper than individual pests. Because the soil itself, the medium in which the potato lives and grows, is far more complicated than it looks from the surface. Soil is not just dirt. This seems obvious when you say it out loud, but most of us treat soil as a kind of neutral backdrop to the real story, the plants we grow in it. The truth is that soil is a living system of almost incomprehensible complexity, and the relationship between that living system and the potato plant growing inside it determines almost everything about the quality, quantity, and health of the potatoes that eventually come out of the ground. Let's start with the physical structure, because this matters enormously for potatoes specifically. Potatoes need what farmers call friable soil, loose, crumbly, well-drained soil that allows tubers to expand freely in all directions without hitting resistance. If the soil is too compacted, the tubers can't grow to their full size. If it's too heavy with clay, water pools around the developing tubers and creates the perfect conditions for rot and disease. If it's too sandy, water drains away too quickly, and the tubers can't get enough moisture at critical growth stages. The ideal potato soil is something like a perfectly made bed, well fluffed, structured, neither too wet nor too dry, with enough organic matter to hold moisture without waterlogging. Farmers spend enormous amounts of time and energy creating this condition through a process called ridging, where the soil around young potato plants is mounded up into raised rows, giving the tubers space to develop underground and improving drainage. Aerial shot of ridged potato field, neat, geometric rows stretching to the horizon. But beneath that carefully managed surface, the chemistry of the soil is equally critical, and this is where things get genuinely fascinating. Potatoes are, by almost any measure, one of the most nutrient-hungry crops in agriculture. Producing a single ton of potatoes removes from the soil roughly 6 kilograms of nitrogen, 3 kilograms of phosphorus, and 10 kilograms of potassium, along with smaller but still significant quantities of calcium, magnesium, sulfur, and trace elements including iron, zinc, manganese, boron, and copper. These numbers are not just statistics. Each nutrient plays a specific, irreplaceable role in the development of the underground tuber. Nitrogen drives the production of proteins and chlorophyll. It's what keeps the leaves green and productive leaves mean more photosynthesis, more energy, more starch available to be sent underground to the developing tubers. Too little nitrogen, and the plant becomes stunted, pale, and weak. But too much nitrogen, interestingly, causes a different problem. It pushes the plant to keep producing leaf growth at the expense of tuber development, resulting in huge, lush, beautiful plants above ground and a disappointingly small harvest below. Potassium is arguably even more critical to the tuber itself. It regulates water movement in and out of cells, controls the opening and closing of the tiny pores in leaves called stomata, and is directly involved in the synthesis and transport of starch from leaves to tubers. A potato growing in potassium-deficient soil will be small, poorly formed, and will store badly after harvest. Phosphorus affects root development and is critical in the early stages of growth, helping the young plant establish the root network it needs to access water and minerals. Every element has a role. Every element must be present in the right quantity at the right time. And managing this underground chemistry is one of the most demanding intellectual tasks in all of agriculture. But here is something that has only become clear to scientists in the last few decades, and it has changed the way many farmers think about their soil entirely. The potato plant is not getting all its nutrients alone. Beneath the roots, woven through the soil in a network of extraordinary complexity, are the threads of underground fungi, not the harmful kind, but a vast community of beneficial fungi called mycorrhizae. The word comes from the Greek words for fungus and root, and the relationship between mycorrhizal fungi and plant roots is one of the most remarkable partnerships in the natural world. Here's how it works. The fungal threads, called hyphae, are far thinner than plant roots. They can penetrate into tiny soil pores that roots could never reach. They extend the effective reach of the plant's root system by an enormous amount, accessing water and mineral reserves that would otherwise be completely unavailable. In exchange for this service, the plant provides the fungi with sugars, photosynthetically produced energy that the fungi, which have no leaves and no ability to photosynthesize, desperately need. It is a trade. The plant gives energy, the fungi give access, both benefit. In naturally healthy soil, this partnership is so powerful that plants connected to mycorrhizal networks can access nutrients across areas many times larger than their physical root systems would suggest. Scientists have found that mycorrhizal networks can connect not just one plant but multiple plants, creating underground networks sometimes called, rather poetically, the Wood Wide Web, where resources and even chemical signals can travel from one plant to another through the fungal threads. Whether potato plants truly share resources through these networks the way trees in a forest do is still being researched. But what is clear is that potatoes growing in soil with healthy mycorrhizal communities are measurably more resilient, more productive, and better able to withstand drought and disease than potatoes growing in soil where those communities have been damaged by excessive tillage or chemical overuse. This is one of the reasons that regenerative farming practices, reducing tillage, using cover crops, minimizing soil disturbance, are gaining so much attention from potato farmers around the world. They're not just philosophical preferences. They are strategies for protecting an underground community that the potato needs in order to thrive. And speaking of underground communities, let's talk about something that happens in the soil every single day, in every potato field in the world, that almost nobody ever thinks about. The bacteria. Not the harmful ones, the beneficial ones, the decomposers, the nitrogen fixers, the mineral unleasers, the invisible workforce that makes everything above and below ground possible. Soil bacteria are so numerous, so diverse, and so constantly active that the soil they inhabit is essentially a chemical factory operating at a scale that human industry can barely approach. One of their most critical functions for potato farming is the cycling of nitrogen. Nitrogen is essential to all plant life, we've established that. But here's the problem. The air around us is about 78% nitrogen, and yet plants can't use atmospheric nitrogen directly. They need it in a specific chemical form, nitrate or ammonium, that they can absorb through their roots. This is where bacteria come in. Certain species of bacteria in the soil can fix atmospheric nitrogen. They can take the nitrogen molecules in the air that fills the tiny pore spaces between soil particles and convert them into ammonia, which then gets further converted by other bacteria into nitrate, the form that plant roots can absorb. Other bacteria specialize in decomposing organic matter, dead plant material, animal waste, the bodies of other organisms, and releasing the nutrients locked inside them back into the soil in forms that plants can use. This process, called mineralization, is essentially how soil fertility is continually renewed in natural systems. The underground potato sits at the center of this whole microbial economy, drawing constantly on the nutrients that bacteria are releasing, while simultaneously releasing its own chemical signals through its roots, a process called rhizode that influences which bacteria and fungi thrive in the soil immediately around it. In other words, the potato is not passively sitting in the soil waiting for nutrients to arrive. It is actively shaping its own underground environment. It is selecting, to some extent, the microbial community it wants around it. The more scientists look at this, the more they realize that the underground life of a potato plant is not just chemistry and physics. It has elements of something that looks, at a microscopic level, almost like strategy. Now let's talk about water, because water is at the heart of everything in the underground life of a potato, and the way potatoes manage water is both beautiful and surprisingly fragile. The potato plant is not drought tolerant. This is one of the fundamental truths of potato farming that shapes everything from where potatoes are grown to how they're irrigated to when they're planted. A potato plant needs consistent moisture throughout its life cycle, but it needs different amounts at different stages. And matching water supply to water need underground, where you can't see what's happening, is one of the greatest skills in potato farming. In the early stages of growth, the plant needs moderate moisture to support root establishment and shoot development. The seed potato itself provides some buffer, but if the soil is too dry during these first weeks, root development can be compromised in ways that affect the entire season. As the plant enters the vegetative phase, putting on leaf growth above ground, water needs increase. The leaves are photosynthesizing actively, and water is needed both for the photosynthesis itself and to prevent the leaves from wilting and closing the stomata, which would shut down photosynthesis entirely. But the most critical period is tuber bulking. This is when developing potatoes, already formed at the stolon tips, already beginning to accumulate starch, are drawing enormous amounts of water from the roots to support their rapid expansion. A potato is, by weight, approximately 80% water. All of that water had to come from somewhere, and it comes from the roots, and the roots need it from the soil. If water supply is inconsistent during tuber bulking, if there's a dry spell followed by heavy rain or irregular irrigation, the tubers respond in ways that are clearly visible at harvest. Irregular water supply during bulking causes a condition called hollow heart, where the rapid expansion creates internal cavities inside the potato. It causes knobby, irregular shapes. It causes cracking. It causes secondary growth, where a tuber that has temporarily stopped bulking suddenly resumes with a burst of growth that creates bizarre, branched, irregular shapes that are completely impossible to sell commercially. All of these problems are underground. None of them are visible from the surface. The farmer cannot see them happening. They can only be detected at harvest, or with modern technology through careful soil moisture monitoring that allows farmers to keep water supply as consistent as possible throughout the critical growth period. And then, right when the plant is at its most productive, right when the tubers are at their peak of development, something happens above ground that changes everything below. The plant begins to die. Senescence, that's the technical word for it, the deliberate programmed aging and death of the above-ground parts of the plant. As summer moves toward autumn, as the days shorten and temperatures begin to drop, the potato plant gets a signal, through the same photoperiod detecting system in its leaves that triggered tuberization in the first place, that the season is ending, and it begins to redirect everything it has left into the tubers. The leaves yellow, the stems hollow out. Nutrients that were in the leaves are mobilized and sent downward into the underground tubers, top-dressing the developing potatoes with a final surge of minerals and energy. The green photosynthetic machinery is dismantled, the chlorophyll broken down, the structural proteins recycled. Above ground, it looks like death, and technically, the above-ground part of the plant is dying. But underground, the potato is doing something very different. It is hardening. As the plant dies back, the skin of each tuber, which was previously thin and delicate, easily damaged by handling, undergoes a process called skin set. The cells in the outermost layer begin to form suberin, a waxy, waterproof polymer that creates a tough, protective barrier around the entire potato. This is the skin you see when you pick up a potato at the supermarket. That papery, slightly rough surface is the result of this hardening process. Skin set is critical for storage. A potato with properly set skin can be stored for months at low temperatures with minimal weight loss and minimal disease. A potato harvested too early, before skin set is complete, is vulnerable to mechanical damage during harvest, and any break in that soft skin is an entry point for bacteria, fungi, and molds that can destroy an entire storage facility full of potatoes in a matter of weeks. This is why harvest timing in potato farming is not just about when the potatoes have reached the right size. It's about knowing when the skin is ready. And that knowledge comes from experience, from feeling the soil, from watching the plants, from sometimes gently digging up a single potato and rubbing a thumb across its skin to see if it slides off or holds firm. In the age of GPS, remote sensing, and soil moisture monitoring, some things still come down to the feel of a potato in your hand and the judgment of someone who has grown them for 30 years. Let's go back in time for a moment, because to fully understand why the potato is what it is, why it grows the way it grows, why it stores the way it stores, why it became the food that changed history, we need to go back to where it came from. The Andes Mountains of South America, specifically the high Altiplano, the high plateau around Lake Titicaca on the border of what is now Peru and Bolivia, an altitude of 3,000 to 4,000 meters above sea level, cold nights, warm days, thin air, bright sun, thin, acidic volcanic soil. This is where the potato was born. Not created by humans, but found growing wild, among many hundreds of species of wild potato plants that evolved in this challenging, high-altitude environment over millions of years. The wild ancestors of the potato developed the underground tuber not as a food for humans, but as a survival mechanism for themselves. The high Andes Plateau has harsh winters. The above-ground parts of any plant are destroyed by frost, but underground, protected by the insulating mass of soil, a tuber full of starch and water could survive the cold months, and then, when spring came, regenerate an entirely new plant from those stored reserves. The tuber was the plant's way of cheating death, of surviving winter not as a dormant seed, but as a fully stocked underground food bank, ready to spring back to life the moment conditions improved. The people of the Andes, particularly the ancestors of the Inca, found these wild tubers and recognized their extraordinary qualities. Here was a food that could be grown at altitudes where almost nothing else would survive. Here was a food that could be preserved almost indefinitely using a technique called chuño, a process of freeze-drying that the high-altitude climate made naturally possible, alternating cold nights that froze the potatoes solid with sunny days that slowly dried them out, eventually producing small, hard, almost stone-like objects that could be stored for years without refrigeration. The Inca built their empire in part on this foundation. Chuño could be stored in underground warehouses, taking advantage of the cool, stable temperatures of the earth itself, and distributed across the vast Inca road network to feed armies, feed workers building enormous stone structures, feed communities through droughts and crop failures. The potato didn't just feed the Inca, it gave them the logistical foundation for a civilization. And then in the 16th century, the Spanish arrived. The Spanish conquistadors who arrived in South America in the 1530s were looking for gold. They found something, in the long arc of history, worth considerably more. They found the potato. The earliest Spanish accounts describe encountering the papa, the Quechua word for potato, being grown and eaten throughout the Andes. Some accounts are dismissive. Some are puzzled. A few are genuinely fascinated. But someone, at some point in the mid-16th century, put potatoes on a ship heading back to Europe. And that decision changed the world. The potato arrived in Europe, probably Spain first, then gradually spreading to Italy, then north to the British Isles, Germany, the Low Countries, and was met, initially, with deep suspicion. It was suspicious partly because it grew underground, which in the folklore of the time was associated with dark, hidden, potentially sinister things. It was suspicious because it was a New World food, and European scholars spent considerable energy debating whether New World plants could possibly be safe for Old World bodies. It was suspicious because it belonged to the nightshade family, the Solanaceae, a botanical family that in Europe was primarily known for deadly nightshade, henbane, and mandrake, plants with well-established toxic properties. In fact, this suspicion was not entirely unfounded. The leaves of the potato plant are mildly toxic. The berries it produces above ground are toxic. Green potatoes, potatoes that have been exposed to light and begun producing chlorophyll, contain elevated levels of a toxic compound called solanine, which can cause serious illness in large amounts. But the tuber itself, cooked or even eaten raw in moderate quantities, is perfectly safe, and it is extraordinarily nutritious. A single medium potato contains significant quantities of vitamin C, potassium, vitamin B6, folate, iron, and magnesium. It provides complex carbohydrates for sustained energy. It has more potassium than a banana. And in an era before refrigeration, when winter vegetables were scarce and deficiency diseases like scurvy were genuinely common, the potato was almost miraculously useful. It took time for Europe to accept this. It took famines, ironically, in some countries, where desperate populations discovered that the potato would grow in poor soil, in small plots of land, in conditions where grain crops had failed, and would produce more calories per acre than almost any alternative food they had access to. Frederick the Great of Prussia reportedly used a clever strategy to encourage his subjects to adopt the potato. He had royal potato fields planted and guarded, suggesting that something so carefully protected must be valuable, and counting on human curiosity to lead local farmers to steal the plants and grow them on their own land. Whether the story is entirely true or slightly embellished, it illustrates the real difficulty of convincing a population to change its fundamental dietary habits. By the mid-18th century, the potato had conquered Europe, not militarily, not politically, but nutritionally. It fed the poor who couldn't afford grain. It fed the working classes who needed calorie-dense food for physical labor. It allowed populations to grow in ways that had previously been impossible because more people could be fed from the same amount of land. And that population growth, fueled in significant part by the potato, contributed to the labor supply that powered the Industrial Revolution. The humble underground tuber, growing in darkness, shaped the modern world. Maps showing potatoes spread across Europe, population growth charts. But let's come back to the present. Because the potato's story underground is still being written, and some of what's being written right now, in laboratories and research fields around the world, is genuinely astonishing. One of the most important areas of research in potato science is the development of disease-resistant varieties. And this brings us back to Phytophthora infestans, the organism that caused the Irish famine, because despite nearly 2 centuries of trying, we have still not fully solved the problem it poses. The challenge is evolution. Phytophthora infestans evolves. It reproduces sexually as well as asexually, which means it can generate new genetic combinations and new strains that may have resistance to fungicides, or the ability to overcome the resistance genes that plant breeders have introduced into potato varieties. Every time a new resistant variety is released, the pathogen has the potential, over years, to evolve around that resistance. It is an arms race, and it has been going on for more than 150 years. Modern plant breeders are using genetic tools that would have seemed like science fiction to the scientists who struggled to respond to the Irish famine. Gene editing technologies, including CRISPR-Cas9, are being used to introduce or modify specific genes in potato varieties, conferring resistance not just to Phytophthora, but to multiple diseases simultaneously, while maintaining the yield, taste, and cooking properties that commercial markets require. In the wild relatives of the potato, those hundreds of species still growing in the mountains of South America, scientists are finding a genetic treasure chest of disease resistance, drought tolerance, and cold hardiness that thousands of years of isolation in challenging environments has generated. These wild relatives can't be eaten. Many of them contain high levels of alkaloids or have very small, bitter tubers. But their genes can be crossed into cultivated varieties through breeding programs that are extraordinarily patient and meticulous. A single new potato variety, from initial cross to commercial release, can take 15 to 20 years to develop. And the researchers working on this know that even when they release it, the evolutionary clock is already ticking on how long the disease resistance will hold. There is another area of potato science that is perhaps even more transformative, and it concerns what happens underground in a way that touches on some of the deepest questions about sustainable agriculture. Carbon, specifically, the role that potato fields and the living soil ecosystem underneath them can play in either releasing or capturing atmospheric carbon dioxide. Agriculture is currently responsible for a significant portion of global greenhouse gas emissions. Plowing and tilling soil, which has been the foundation of agriculture for thousands of years, releases carbon that has been stored in soil organic matter back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. The more a soil is disturbed, the more carbon it loses. But soil can also work in the opposite direction. Healthy soil with high organic matter content and active microbial communities can capture carbon from the atmosphere and store it underground in a stable form for decades or even centuries. This process, called carbon sequestration, is increasingly being seen as a potentially important tool in addressing climate change. Potato farming, with its traditionally intensive tillage requirements, those carefully prepared, deeply turned, ridged seedbeds, has not historically been a leader in carbon sequestration. But this is beginning to change. Research into minimum tillage and no-till potato systems is ongoing, trying to find ways to prepare the seedbed, manage weeds, and control disease without the deep, repeated soil disturbance that has characterized conventional potato production. Cover crops planted between potato seasons are being used to protect the soil surface, add organic matter, and maintain the mycorrhizal networks and microbial communities that deep tillage would otherwise destroy. Even the humble act of leaving potato vines in the field after harvest, rather than removing them, returns organic matter to the soil, feeding the microbial communities below and slowly rebuilding the soil structure that intensive farming can degrade. The potato field of the future may look quite different from the potato fields of today. And what is driving that change is a new understanding of and respect for the invisible, underground world on which everything depends. Now let's go back underground one more time, because there's a chapter in the potato's underground story that we haven't told yet. The moment of harvest. Everything the potato plant has done, all the chemistry, all the communication between leaf and tuber, all the navigation of roots through soil, all the defensive barriers against disease and pest, all the months of careful starch accumulation, has been building toward this one moment. And it happens fast. Modern potato harvesting equipment moves through a field at a steady pace, cutting into the ridges with a wide metal blade that runs just below the surface of the soil. The blade undercuts the potato ridge, lifting the entire mass of soil and plants and potatoes onto a moving chain elevator. The elevator shakes and vibrates, sifting soil back to the ground. And there, emerging from the darkness of the soil where they've been growing for months, utterly unseen, the potatoes appear. For a farmer who has been watching that field every day, watching the weather, managing the irrigation, monitoring for disease, hoping, this moment has an emotional weight that is difficult to overstate. In an instant, you can see what the season has actually produced: the size of the tubers, the skin quality, the yield per meter of row. You can see whether there's wireworm damage or scab or cracking from irregular water supply. You can see whether the season's decisions, the planting date, the variety, the fertilizer, the irrigation management, were good ones. Everything that was hidden is revealed. And experienced farmers say there is something genuinely moving about this moment, something that doesn't get old even after decades of farming. The transformation of a bare field through months of invisible underground work into heaps of potatoes that will feed thousands of people. This is one of the most fundamental acts of human civilization, still being performed, still carrying weight, still mattering to the people who do it. Golden evening light on a harvested potato field. The farmer pauses beside the harvester, holding a potato in both hands, looking at it. The potatoes don't rest when they leave the field. And here, in the final chapter of the underground story, we should spend a moment in the storage facility, because what happens there is also, in a quiet way, remarkable. Potatoes that will be stored for months, not consumed immediately, go into large, climate-controlled buildings where temperature, humidity, and even the atmosphere inside the storage are carefully managed. In the first few weeks after harvest, the potatoes need warmth, around 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, to allow the skin to complete the curing process and for any small wounds from harvest to heal. The potato does this actively. Exposed flesh at a wound site generates a kind of chemical scar tissue, depositing suberin and wound periderm cells that seal the opening against bacteria and moisture loss. The potato heals itself. Then, gradually, the temperature is dropped to somewhere between 4 and 7 degrees Celsius, where respiration, the potato's ongoing metabolic processes, slows to a minimum, reducing weight loss and extending storage life. But there's a problem. At these low temperatures, the starch inside the potato slowly converts to sugar. Cold storage causes a potato to sweeten, a phenomenon called cold sweetening, which may sound appealing but is actually a serious problem for potatoes destined for processing. A potato with elevated sugar content, when fried or baked at high temperature, produces excessive browning and produces elevated levels of a compound called acrylamide that forms when amino acids and sugars react together at high temperatures. Managing this cold sweetening, finding the balance between cold enough to prevent sprouting and rot, but not so cold that the starch-to-sugar conversion becomes a problem, is one of the ongoing technical challenges of large-scale potato storage. And yes, sprouting. Even in cool storage, eventually, the potato's dormancy period ends and those eyes we noticed at the very beginning, those dormant buds on the skin surface, begin to wake up. Sprouts emerge. The potato wants to grow again. It has been doing exactly what evolution designed it to do, storing energy underground through the cold months and then responding to the signals of a warming world by sending out new shoots. It doesn't know it's in a concrete storage building in Idaho or Yorkshire or the Punjab. It doesn't know that there's no soil to grow into. It just knows that dormancy is over. And in that stubborn, tireless drive to grow, to reach, to expand, to do the thing that millions of years of evolution have prepared it to do, there is something quietly wonderful. Close up of a potato sprout, pale and determined, emerging from a stored potato in a dark storage building. The same image we started with, a pale shoot pushing toward something invisible. We've been on quite a journey. From the first quiet stirring of a bud inside a seed potato, through the extraordinary underground engineering of stolons and tubers, through the invisible wars against phytophthora and wireworm, through the chemical conversations between leaves and underground flesh, through the mycorrhizal networks that connect the potato to the living community of the soil. We've followed the secret life of potatoes into places that most people never think about. And we've seen how that underground world connects to things much larger than any individual plant or any individual field. The potato fed an empire in the Andes before Europe knew it existed. It arrived in Europe and slowly, reluctantly changed the diet and demography of an entire continent. It powered, indirectly, the Industrial Revolution. It failed catastrophically and caused one of the worst humanitarian disasters in the history of the Western world. It continues today to be the fourth most important food crop on Earth, feeding more than 1 billion people in one form or another, on every inhabited continent. And all of this grew out of a dark, quiet, invisible process happening underground, completely out of sight, asking for no attention, running through its extraordinary sequence of biological events with the same unhurried precision it used 10,000 years ago in the high mountains of the Andes. The potato doesn't need us to watch it. It doesn't need us to understand it. It has been growing in the dark long before humans found it, and will continue doing so long after the last farming decision is made. But there is something to be said for watching, for understanding, for following that pale shoot through the darkness and seeing what it becomes. Because the next time you hold a potato in your hands, that familiar weight, that earthy smell, that rough, papery skin, you'll know what it took to get there. Months of invisible labor, a community of billions of underground organisms, all playing their part, roots navigating through darkness, leaves reading the length of the day and sending messages downward, the careful hardening of skin against the cold world, a journey from seed to harvest that has been happening in one form or another for 10,000 years. All of that is in your hands. It is, if you stop to think about it, something close to extraordinary.